Hello, this is Miss Macbeth. I heard there were some sound issues with some of the other videos I made, so I'm going to try to make this one off of my phone and see if I get a better sound quality this time. So today we're going to be talking about the difference between ser and estar. I'm not going to go over the conjugations of ser and estar. If you want to look in your book to find those conjugations, you can. That's kind of the easy part. I'm just going to focus on why we would use one over the other. Now, the differences between ser and estar is a key example of how in Spanish we would have two things whenever in English we just have one, right? Remember whenever we were learning the formal versus the informal in Spanish 1, right? We noticed that there are two ways of talking to people, one that we would use in polite kind of ways that we might use whenever we're getting to know someone, for example, that we don't know, or someone who's in authority over us. And then we have another way that we talk to people who we're familiar with. When we were learning irregular yo verbs, right, we learned that there are two ways to use the word to know, right? We have saber, which we would use whenever we're talking about informational things, and then we have conocer, that we would use whenever we're talking about things that we have some type of personal experience with, like people we've met or places that we've been. So we already know that often in Spanish we will have two things, and those two things indicate a specificity that doesn't exist in English. So one of the things that people often wonder is, why are there two things in Spanish when in English there are just one, or there is just one? Some of that has to do with the origins of Spanish. The origins of the difference between ser and estar, for example, date all the way back to the kind of Celtic origins of the Spanish language. But some of that just has to do with the fact that the Spanish language is much more specific than English is. So if they're going to use a verb, they're going to use it for a specific reason, they're going to use it in a specific context, and they're going to have a specific purpose, right? So that is part of the reason why there is a difference between ser and estar. Other than that, I can't give you a whole lot of information other than to say you just have to memorize the difference between ser and estar. It's common, right, with other languages that there are elements of that language which are hard for you to understand, or for someone who's learning the language to understand, because it's not like the first language, right, the native language. And that's just a part of what learning a foreign language is about. So let's start with the differences between the way we view ser and the way we view estar. So both of these verbs mean to be. So when I say estoy, in Spanish I'm saying, or in English I'm saying, right, I am. If I say yo soy, in English I'm also saying I am, but I'm saying a different type of personal state of being. And that's the part that it's important to kind of remember. So when we're using ser, we want to think about items that have an element of permanence about them. Things that we don't think of as temporary, or things that take a very long time to change. So that's the important thing to remember about ser. For example, when we think of origin, you can't change your origin. You may change your country, you may change your citizenship, but you will always be from the same location because your origin is just where you were born. If we think about nationality, right, that is something that's very difficult to change. Getting citizenship in a country like getting citizenship in the United States, in an easy process, it can take a minimum of 5 years. In a long process, it can take much more and costs thousands and thousands of dollars, right, to become a US citizen. In other countries, you have to have a permanent or marry someone who is a citizen in order to gain that citizenship. So it's not something that is easy to change, that you can change from one day to the next. It requires a long thought out process. So that's one of the reasons why nationality would be thought of as being more permanent. Things like professions are also something that wouldn't be able to change overnight. For example, you couldn't wake up tomorrow and say, I want to be a lawyer, right? You would have to go to school, you would have to study, you would have to take the bar, you would have to do all the processes that it would take to be a lawyer. If you are a student, that's also viewed as a profession. If you are a volunteer, that's also viewed as a profession. So anything that would fall under the kind of scope of profession or vocation would be considered something that is more permanent, because it would take a long time to change that, to change and go from one career maybe into another. Dates and times are something that people find a little confusing as to why it's instead, right? We wake up every day and it's a different day, but we do have a calendar system. And so whether we like that calendar system or don't like that calendar system, every year, right, we're going to have a May 5th. Every year we're going to have an October 31st. Every year we're going to have a Christmas, right? We're going to have a December 25th. So even though those dates are changing every day, there's an element of permanence because every year we have the same days in the calendar. The one that sometimes can confuse people, right, is leap year, because that only comes every 4 years, but it does come every 4 years. My great-grandfather, for example, was born on leap year and only celebrated his birthday once every 4 years, but it did come around once every 4 years. So even though the calendar date is changing every day, the calendar system itself is a system of permanence. The same thing with the time, right? Even though every minute that goes by, it's a different time, we're still gonna only have 24 hours within that window of time. And whether you want 5 p.m. or midnight or 8 a.m. to come, they're always going to come regardless. So those are things that are viewed as being a little bit more permanent, because even though they are kind of minute to minute, they might be changing, or every day they might be changing, but there's a system set up that indicates an element of permanence. Every 24-hour window has the same amount of minutes, seconds, hours within it, similar to how every year has the same amount of days and the same months and the same dates within it. So that has an element of permanence. With characteristics and descriptions, this one is a little bit the same. They might talk about the same things. It just has to do with describing people, describing things. We think of those things as having an element of permanence. For example, if a woman is handsome or attractive, she may wake up 20 years from now and be older, but it's probably a good guess that unless she's had substantial plastic surgery, that she'll still be attractive. If someone is intelligent, that intelligence is something that they will carry with them, whether they're a student, whether they're a doctor. So we think of those characteristics as being much more permanent. When we're thinking about descriptions as well, those things have an element of permanence about it. For example, if your house is blue and you decided that you wanted to paint it white, you would have to go out, you would have to get paint, you would have to put a process in place, maybe even hire painters if you don't know how to paint, in order to make the house go from being blue to being white. It's unlikely that you would be able to make that change within a 24-hour to 48-hour window. You would have to put some kind of process in place in order to make that happen. So those things are considered to have an element of more permanence. Other things that have permanence are things like identity. We think of identity as identifying, like maybe if a book belongs to someone, if a dress belongs to someone, if a person has a relationship to you, right? If they are your cousin, if they are your sister, that's creating an identity for them that is somehow attached. Also, impersonal sayings are always said. For example, whenever we say in English, oh, that's right, that's true. Things like that are what we could call impersonal sayings, and those would always use said. Also, locations of events are always going to use said as well. That's just a little list of them. Let's go through each one of those after we've talked a little bit about how Estar is different. So I'll go through them again and give some examples so that you can get an idea, but we'll do that in just a minute. Estar is considered to be things that we might think of as being more temporary or transient. I'm not sure I've spelled the word transient correctly. I think maybe it has a C in it. Well, things that are more temporary. So anything that's going to change within a 24-hour to 48-hour window is something that is temporary. For example, physical and emotional conditions. So your mood is something that is going to constantly be changing. If you're happy, it doesn't guarantee that you're going to be happy in a little while. Maybe you get a bad test back and then you're really sad. Maybe somebody dies. Maybe, you have a sprained ankle. All of these things, right, can lead to temporary emotions. Similarly, right, if you're sad, maybe you won't always be sad. You go to a funeral and you're really upset, but then someone tells you a joke and you think, you know what, the person that passed away would have really enjoyed this joke. And you laugh. So emotions are something that is always changing. It's not something that we would consider to be more permanent. It's something that's always in a kind of an ongoing feeling of flux. Physical conditions would fall within that category as well. Physical conditions like being dirty, being clean, being organized, being disorganized, being sick. All of those things are things that are in a constant state of flux. Even if you're a hypochondriac, you might one day decide that you have one illness, or another day you have another illness, or if someone else, feels like they're constantly sick, you have a friend that is always feeling like they're ill. Maybe they have different illnesses every single time. If you are dirty because you've been out playing soccer, you might come in, and then when you come in, you take a shower, and then suddenly you're clean again. If your room is very disorganized, you could come in, you could clean it, then it's very organized. Anybody who has kids would tell you, right, you can get your entire house sparkling clean, the kids come home, and immediately everything is a mess. It's like you did nothing, right? So things like that, physical conditions, are things that are constantly changing. Another thing that would always be changing is your current action. So you can look in your book, right, and learn how to use the present progressive. It's a particular type of tense that we use in English all the time. The present progressive in English is things like I'm going, I'm doing my homework, I'm reading, you're reading. That kind of ing gerund at the end of a verb indicates the use of a present progressive. We have this in Spanish as well, we just don't use it as frequently. When we use the present progressive, we are using it to indicate an action that is currently taking place whenever the speaker is doing it. So for example, if you were physically reading and someone said to you, "What are you doing right now?" you would say, "I'm reading." And in Spanish, you would also say, "I am reading." In Spanish, the present progressive is used much less, so maybe more like 15 or 20%. And the present tense, which you already learned, is used the other 80%. In English, it's probably the opposite. We use the present progressive somewhere like 90%, and we use the present tense 10%. So that's part of why people find using the present progressive in Spanish to be very confusing, because it's a very common tense in English, and it's not as common in Spanish, but we only use it whenever we're talking about current activities that we are in the process of doing. So I'll give you an example. If you're currently reading, your mom calls you from the other room and she says, "I need you to come and vacuum." Well, that current activity has suddenly moved from being reading to being something else. So your current activity is something that is constantly in a state of flux. That's why we use the present progressive, as opposed to the present tense, which indicates a kind of habitual type of activity. Another thing that can always be changing is your current location. For example, right now I am in a classroom making this video for you. I'm trying to use a tripod that I purchased for this particular thing. If I wanted to, I could exit this classroom, walk down a little bit, I could be at the library, or I could be at the office. I could move over to the theater, right? Anywhere I wanted to go, I could go there. And I don't have to stay there. I can walk somewhere else. It doesn't matter. Even if you're someone who, like for example, never leaves your home, you're always moving somewhere in the house, right? Not always doing the same activity. So, and that's just in general, right? A generalized kind of view of how people move about in life. We can be here one minute and somewhere else the next. That's why current locations or current places are things that are going to use estar, right? Because it's always something that's going to be changing. Also, the weather is something that will use estar. And that's because the weather is also something that is in a constant state of flux. We live in Florida, so of course we know that the weather is always changing. It can be sunny outside and you're outside and suddenly it's raining, right? Out of nowhere. And then the rain stops and the sun is still out and you don't know why there was a sun shower, but it just happened. Weather is like that, right? It's constantly in a state of flux. So one thing that we want to think about is with estar, right? Is that estar is always for things that are going to change within a 24-hour to 48-hour window. It's things that are in a constant state of changing. They change very quickly and they'll change immediately. So that's why we would use estar. There are numerous acronyms that people sometimes use to memorize when they would use estar. Things like CAP, or things that I've learned in the past, right? Conditions, actions, places. It's something that sometimes people use to think about estar. Now, the one thing that I will say is that whenever you're trying to figure out the difference between ser and estar, it's always going to be easier to start with if it uses estar. So if you're trying to decide whether you're going to use ser or estar, this list is much longer and much more detailed than this 4-item list. So it's always going to be easier to say, well, is it a condition? Something that someone is currently feeling, or something that someone is currently in a physical condition of? Is it a current action? Does it use an ando or a yendo, right? That's the Spanish version of the ing. Is it talking about where someone is currently located? Is it a weather item? And if it doesn't fit any of those categories, then you can move very safely on to using ser. Now let me go through some examples of how these would be different, so that way you can get a really clear idea of how we would use the difference between ser and estar. So here, right, I've listed some examples. In origin, for example, soy de los Estados Unidos. I am from the United States. My country of origin is the United States. We can use this for all sorts of different origins. Soy de Francia, soy de Rusia, soy de Africa, no? All sorts of different ones. Anywhere we're talking about origin. Soy de Sebring, soy de Evan Park, soy de Arcadia. You know, I'm from all these different cities. Soy de Orlando, you know, I'm from Orlando. So all of those different types of origins, cities or places or regions, all those origins would use ser. If we're talking about nationality, it's also going to use ser. La tía es venezolana. Yo soy estadounidense. Ella es dominicana. Ella es puertorriqueña. Anytime we're using a nationality, we're going to use ser. Also, when we're talking about professions, remember, right, being a student is a profession. So, soy estudiante. Mario es abogado. Mario is a lawyer. Rosa es doctora. Rosa is a doctor. Anything like that, right? Ella es enfermera. Ella es secretaria. All of these different types of careers or professions would also use ser. If we're talking about dates or times, today is I don't remember what day it is today, the 14th of January. So, es el 14 de enero. In a week, it'll be, or in 2 weeks, it'll be February, right? Es febrero. Es 2020. It's 2020. Es el 3 de marzo. It's the 3rd of March. We would also use it when we're thinking about time. So currently right now, right, it is but it's a quarter to 2. So I would say, es un cuarto para las 2. It's a quarter to 2. Or if I would say, right, son las 11:30. You remember whenever we were learning time, right, we learned es la 1, son las 2, son las 3, son las 4. We learned ser without learning why we were learning it, but we learned it. When we're describing people, Rogelio es alto y guapo. Isabela es inteligente y atractiva. Él es bajo y gordito, no? All of these different types of things, right, characteristics would use ser. Also, when we're describing things, right? For example, la casa es grande y moderna. The house is big and very modern, or modern. So those are descriptions of things, and we would use ser. If we're talking about identity, either the identity of a thing or the identity of a person in relationships, el libro es de Juan, es mi prima, es mi novio. So if you're identifying someone in a relationship, that's my cousin, that's my boyfriend, that's my spouse, you would use ser. When we're using impersonal sayings like es cierto, es verdad, es correcto, we would always use ser. And if we're talking about the location of an event, we would also use ser. La fiesta es en un restaurante. When we're talking about temporary things, we're going to use estar. Now, without realizing this, you've been doing it from the time period that we talked about saludos y despedidas, or greetings. Whenever you were asking about greetings, you said, ¿Cómo estás? Meaning, how are you currently in this moment doing? How are you currently feeling? What is your current mood? What are you currently feeling and going through in this moment, right? So we're using estar to indicate that it is a current mood or feeling or physical condition or emotional condition. And you didn't even realize that you were doing it, but that's what you were doing. So if we think about emotions, we might say, estoy feliz, estoy triste, estoy aburrido o aburrida, en mi caso. You would say things like this, right? Talking about different emotions. If you were talking about physical conditions, right, you might say, estoy cansado, estoy enferma, no? Or things like this, right? You would say, el cuarto está sucio, right? The room is dirty. Because, you know, you can go and clean it if you really wanted to. When we're talking about current actions, right, we're going to use ando or yendo. So, Juanita está estudiando. Juanita's current activity is that she is studying. If we're talking about current locations, right, Tomás está en la biblioteca. Tomás is in the library, but maybe if Tomás wants to leave the library and go to his residencia estudiantil, he would be there in a little while. So that's something to kind of think about. And also for weather, right, está lloviendo. Now, there are cases where using ser and using estar would indicate two different things. And that's the thing that you have to remember. They're not interchangeable. They're being used in different situations, talking about different types of things. So why is there ser and why is there estar? Because they are used for different purposes. You can't use them interchangeably, and you can't use them to imply the same thing. For example, if I said, Mariela es rica, I am describing her. I'm saying, Mariela is rich. If I said, la comida está rica, I'm saying the food is delicious. But I'm using está to indicate that I'm talking about something that's delicious as opposed to using this word in the sense of a descriptive word. If I say, Isabela es bonita, I'm saying she's pretty. All the time she's pretty. Every moment she's pretty. If I said, el vestido de Isabela está bonito, I'm saying the dress that she's currently wearing in this moment is attractive. For example, if I say, Gerardo es listo, using ser indicates that I'm using listo to mean that he is clever or cunning. If I use estar with listo, then I'm indicating that someone is ready. Estamos listos para la fiesta. We've all gotten ready and we're ready to go to the party. So using ser and using estar is going to indicate different things. There are some adjectives that you can use either ser or estar for, but remember, it's going to imply different things. So this is something to kind of remember, right? Whenever you're thinking about ser and estar, they're going to be used in two very different cases. When in doubt, again, I would always recommend that first you go through the uses of estar. Is it a physical condition? Is it an emotional condition? Is it a current action? Is it talking about where someone is currently located? Is it a weather state? If it is not any of those things, then you are safe by default to think that it's probably ser. I hope this has helped you to understand the differences between ser and estar, at least a little bit. It is a very complex issue, and so if you haven't grasped it entirely yet, I would recommend that maybe you go to YouTube and find some YouTube tutorials on the differences between ser and estar. It is a common point of confusion for students. This is just meant to be a small recap of this section and not at all meant to be a completely inclusive or completely comprehensive view on this subject matter, but just a quick kind of review on what it is that you can think about when you're starting to think about the differences between ser and estar. I hope it has helped, and as always, I hope you have a really great week. Thank you.